Russia's Putin, along with many others, have long boasted about the rise of BRICS, about this seemingly inevitable usurping of the Western/US-led order. And yet something has gone badly wrong with BRICS. And no one is more exposed than Vladimir Putin, who's already having a bad week. Last year, the president was celebrating BRICS as his masterstroke against the West, some collective strategy of a defiant anti-sanctions alliance that will build this new global order. But this week in Rio, Brazil, well, the illusion rather shattered. The summit flops, President Xi of China bails, and even Iran, Russia's closest remaining ally, left out in the cold. And to make things worse, America's Donald Trump returns with a brutal warning. Any country backing BRICS' anti-American policies will face 10% tariffs. No exceptions. So in this video, I wanted to dissect what these dramatic developments mean. Why Putin specifically, who once has seen BRICS as a weapon, now finds himself increasingly boxed in, not only domestically, but globally. And what could happen? This really is the end of this, well, dream of an anti-Western stratagem.
This is the Global Gambit.
How you going? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be diving into the calamity and fascination of this channel, which is BRICS. We've had guests on to discuss it, we've had debates about it, and well, now we've had the latest summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. A summit that was supposed to be a showcase of unity amongst the world's emerging powers of the global south, but instead, in the eyes of many, exposed deep fractures, rising contradictions, growing bloat and bureaucracy, and geopolitical backfires that may haunt the group for years, making it largely ineffective. Now, I am very curious to know what you think about this, not just from the newest blow to Putin, perhaps, but about BRICS altogether. Do you believe the hype, or is it an overrated entity? Be sure to leave your thoughts in the comments, as there are no right answers. Now, to understand BRICS, let's rewind a little bit. BRICS is originally known as Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. It began as a Goldman Sachs acronym, then evolved into this geopolitical club with lofty ambitions, fairer global representation, reform of the United Nations, and the Bretton Woods system, institutions that were created by, well, predominantly the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War. And this emphasis on a multipolar world, and it seems to be this multipolar world that has made the BRICS almost bigger than it is in the eyes of, well, many people, those who are frustrated and see the hypocrisy of Western nations, especially the United States, the weaponization of the dollar, and so on. This BRICS, therefore, is symbolism of a haven of a new world where greater fairness and balance. And for a time, it has worked. The group gave its members a platform to punch above their weight. It challenged, and does still, the G7 dominance, and well, you cannot deny the size of the population and the growing economies. And they have floated serious ideas, like ditching the US dollar in favor of alternative reserve currencies. But that version of BRICS is seemingly dissipating in the eyes of some. Let's fast forward to this month. The Rio summit was meant to be BRICS' grand comeback after a couple of, well, few years rockiness. Instead, to quote one article, it felt more like a funeral. Only 5 heads of state actually turned up. Xi Jinping, China, who is largely seen by many as the, well, it's China and co, in my opinion, didn't even bother. It's his first ever no-show. Putin did attend, but virtually, of course, because he has to dodge that little thing called an ICC arrest warrant. And the rest, well, keep in mind that BRICS was expanded to 11 nations at the beginning of 2024, but that now means more voices, a greater degree of opinions to consider, and, well, now including Iran and possibly Saudi Arabia, making it even harder still to see how consensus can be reached. What was once, therefore, a tightly coordinated club of emerging democracies and quasi-democracies is now a contradictory mess. The official communique mentioned the word inclusive 39 times. Democratic, just twice. Even more telling, Iran's first summit as a full member brought calls for strong condemnation of the US and Israel given their activities in the past few weeks. And while the BRICS declaration did denounce the attacks on Iran as violations of international law, it didn't name names. Another reminder, BRICS talks loud, but walks softly, especially when the issue might upset Moscow or Beijing. Quick aside, if you have made it this far, then clearly you do take an interest in global power politics, and especially what's coming up in the latter part of the video, where I deeper dive into this setback for Putin. Of course, there is the reemergence of the Trump card. As BRICS leaders gathered for their seemingly awkward family photo, Trump took to social media with a, well, characteristically Trump thread. Quote, "Any country aligning with the anti-American policies of BRICS will face an additional 10% tariff. No exceptions. India, in the midst of finalizing an important trade deal with Washington, was suddenly in a bind. It's now being punished for being in a club it's not even sure it wants to belong to. And behind the scenes, Indian officials say they're not panicking, but they insist they're not trying to undermine the dollar either, and that local currency arrangements are just practical, not political. But the message from Trump is clear. Join Team BRICS even more and prepare to be sanctioned." And so, well, when you think of sanctions, you think of Moscow. So what did Moscow do? They didn't do anything. They stayed silent. Because despite its vocal condemnations of US policy, such as at last year's Kazakh summit, Russia now seems more interested in regaining leverage on Ukraine than defending BRICS allies like Iran. A strategic silence, as always, and demonstrating that really when push comes to shove, even Putin has to consider his options because he cannot play every single card simultaneously. Now, to really understand the collapse at Rio, we have to rewind to Kazakh 2024, Russia's big moment. That summit was everything Rio wasn't. Defiant, bombastic, and anti-Western or United States to its core. Russia used the event to parade its defiance of sanctions and declare the dawn of a multipolar order. Putin himself, or specifically, was very keen to illustrate that he was not an outcast, not sidelined by the international community. Indeed, from Moscow's perspective, BRICS is fundamentally a geopolitical weapon, a platform to rally the so-called world majority against US-led dominance. The branding, inclusive, democratic, multilateral. The reality? Well, a club designed to suit autocrats and weaken liberal norms, or anything that is based on Western ideals. It's the Soviet playbook, dressed up for a new century. Russia and China dominate that stage, while countries like Iran, Egypt, and even possibly Saudi Arabia serve as those strategic add-ons. But even here, Russia's limits are showing, and showing quite, well, clearly. Iran came to Rio hoping for some kind of full-throated solidarity. Instead, it got vague lines about international law. And Russia seemingly just avoided promises or pledges. Why? Because regardless of what Putin claims, in reality, Moscow doesn't want to antagonize Trump even more than it already has done. As I mentioned in a video just yesterday, Trump is back to being more critical of Putin and has reinstigated supplies to Ukraine, not something that Putin needs. And therefore, BRICS is, well, about leverage, not really loyalty. And so most telling, Russia now manufactures most of its own Iranian-styled Shahad drones. So it has no need for Iran. And these supposed lifelong alliances are just disposable and dispensable. Let's talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe the gold bar in the room, the BRICS currency. For years, this group has flirted with launching a gold-backed reserve currency to finally break dollar dominance. On paper, it, well, makes sense. In 2024 alone, BRICS trade topped $5 trillion, 22% of all global exports. I've already emphasized the population size of the members involved and their control of certain things like commodities. But the Rio summit poured a degree of cold water on that fantasy. This 30-page declaration even affirmed the importance of the existing global financial system, hinting that it was never really on the cards. Why? Because the deeper you go, the more strategic divides emerge. I've already mentioned Saudi Arabia and India were the Saudis to join full-time, but then, of course, India and China. India fears a China-led bloc. Brazil needs US trade because of its sphere of influence and just usually how trade relations work. Proximity and physical distance do matter for costs. And most members, for all their anti-Western rhetoric, rely on Western finance. It will take decades to create something at the same level as SWIFT, for example. Not that it can't happen, but at the moment, it's not a viable alternative. And so then comes Trump's threat of 100% tariffs for any blocs that try to create a BRICS currency. That's largely put the conversation into the bin. Could it still re-emerge when a softer head of state in America or a different one takes over from Trump? Quite possibly, but the point is it's not going to be for the time being. So what emerged from Rio is pretty clear. BRICS has no centre and no clear objectives in mind. It has no charter, no binding values, no clear purpose, which is why when people compare it to NATO or seemingly the United Nations, it is preposterous. It is an intergovernmental organization, not a security alliance or the organization that has been created for the entire international community. As it expands, those contradictions also only grow. Egypt and Ethiopia blocked South Africa's UN Security Council bid, for example. Iran rejected the two-state solution. India and China, well, we know, can barely share a room. The group decried Israeli actions in Gaza while ignoring Russia's actions over Ukraine. BRICS isn't bridging divides, it's highlighting them. So BRICS was meant to challenge the Western order. And again, things ebb and flow. Nothing is static in geopolitics, and it could still may well change. But at the current circumstances, in the past week in Rio, it revealed something pretty damning. It's become the very thing it set out to oppose, quite bloated, increasingly fragmented, and seemingly toothless. Russia, the biggest proponent of it as an anti-Western battering ram, well, that's beginning to flay, because the rest, they're not so sure. India is very keen on upholding the international system to a degree and ensuring that, say, the United Nations is more representative with them as a permanent member. If it didn't, it wouldn't bother. Unless BRICS, therefore, can resolve its contradictions and move beyond being simply a vehicle for Russian or even Chinese interests, it'll follow the path of the G77. Talked about, occasionally referenced, but ultimately ignored. And as Trump ramps up those tariff threats and redraws alliances at his own rate, BRICS is learning that being anti-Western without a coherent plan is just performative posturing. This isn't the rise of a new world order yet. It's just the fragmentation of the existing one. And, well, what I personally call an international disorder. If you don't know me, I am Pyotr Kurzin. I am, well, a mixture of English and Russian, having been brought predominantly up in the West, but with strong influences from the East, particularly Russia. And I try to bring those sorts of considerations into what I produce on YouTube. And while we cover Ukraine and Russia a lot, we also cover the international system and how, shall we say, non-Western entities view global issues. So if that appeals to you, then do consider subscribing. I interview diplomats, academics, journalists, having been someone who's worked in the UN and the World Bank myself. I'd like to cut through the noise and actually talk about things factually in a time of disinformation. It's more crucial than ever. But we'll see you on the next one. Take care, everyone.